Now, the most basic thing we need to do when we're creating our websites is to select the elements in our web page in order to manipulate it at a later date. Now, we saw that we can do this in JavaScript by saying something like document.querySelector, and inside here we would add the selector that we want to select, right? So for example, if we wanted the H1, then we can simply say query selector H1. Now, if we were to write this in jQuery, then we can remove all of this part and instead only have the $sign, which is short for jQuery. So now we're using a jQuery method to select our H1, and you can see how much shorter it is. Now, this works very similarly to query selector in the sense that inside the parentheses, we're specifying the CSS selector that we would use if we were to select our elements in CSS. And this is because it's the most flexible, the most adaptable, and also can be very specific. So for example, it allows us to say things like we want the H1 that has a class of title, or we want the H1 that's nested inside a div with the ID of header, and that works exactly the same. There's no changes there. But what the jQuery selector allows us to do is when we're trying to select all of our buttons, if you remember from previously, we had to say something like document.querySelectorAll, and then we would select the button in here. Now with jQuery, the $sign again replaces all of this, and it will select all of the buttons on screen. And there's no difference between selecting one or selecting many. Now previously we briefly saw that we can manipulate the CSS style of a selected element by simply using the .css method from jQuery. So for example, we can select our H1 and we can say .css, and we can add the CSS property that we want to change. So for example, the color, and our second input is the value for that property. So we're going to change it to green this time. And now if I hit save and refresh, then you can see our H1 has been selected and the CSS color property has been changed to green. Now this method is really flexible. For example, you can get the current value of the CSS property by simply having the name of the property in some quotation marks as a string inside the method. And now we can console log the value of this. And when we refresh our website, you'll see that we get the RGB, the red, green, black value of our H1's color, which is black. And if we wanted something like, say, font size, and refresh, then you can see that the current H1 has a font size of 32. And we're getting that by using the .css method. So remember with this method that if you have a single property in it, then you're getting the value of it. And if you have two properties in it, then you're setting the value. Now, as we said before, changing something that's related to the style inside our JavaScript code is not that great. It feels a little bit dirty. And that's because we need to separate our concerns. Keep our JavaScript code all about behavior, keep our style code all about the appearance, and keep our HTML all about content. So how can we do that? Well, what if instead of adding our CSS by using the CSS method, we had a class inside our style sheet? Let's call it big title. And this is going to have a font size of 10 rem, and it's also going to have a color of yellow. And finally, we're going to make the font family cursive. All right, so now that we've got this class inside our style sheet, we can use jQuery to add that class to our selected element. So we're selecting our H1, and by writing .add class, and then inside the parentheses, we'll add the name of the class, which, let's just remind ourselves, was called big-title. Big-title And now if we hit save and refresh, then you can see that we've added all of those awful looking CSS to our H1. And this is a much better way of separating our behavior from our styles. Now, just as you can add class, you can also remove class. So now that we've added this horrendous yellow color, we can select our H1 and use the .remove class method to remove this big title class from our H1. And you can see once I run that, then all of those styles that belong to the big title CSS rule disappears. Now, if you wanted to add or remove multiple classes, let's say we add another one called margin 50, and in this one we simply add a margin of 50 pixels, hit save, and now inside our index.js, in order to add multiple classes, all we need to do is just to include them inside the same set of quotation marks, but with a space in between. So our second class was called margin-50, and now we're selecting our H1 and we're adding all of the classes, so that's big title as well as margin 50. So if we hit save and refresh, you can see that we're getting both classes applied to our H1. Now, another really useful method from jQuery is we can see whether or not if our element has a particular class. So we can select our H1 and then we can say .has class, and we're going to query for the margin 50 class. And now if we hit enter, then you can see that it'll give you a true or false boolean, depending on whether or not the element does indeed have that class applied. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can use jQuery to manipulate not just styles, but also text. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in order to change the text of a selected element using jQuery, there's two ways of going about this. One is you can simply say, select an element, then .text, and inside the parentheses, you'll add the new text that you want it to say. So this will change our hello to a goodbye. As we mentioned before, when we use jQuery to select an HTML element, it selects all of the elements that match that selector on your web page. So if we were to say .text on the buttons, then when we refresh our page, you can see that every single button gets its text updated by simply selecting for all the elements that match this criteria, and then we're using the .text method to change the text that's inside those buttons, which is this part here. Now, if you remember, when we learnt how to do this using plain old vanilla JavaScript, we also had something called inner HTML. And using inner HTML, we were able to not just update text, but we were also able to add HTML. But as we're using jQuery, it's a little bit shorter. So it's simply .html. And inside here, we can add some tags. Say, for example, if we wanted to add the em tag to make our text emphasized, or rather italicized. Now, when we update our website, you can see that the HTML is also taken into consideration because we're using the .html method instead of simply the .text method, which will interpret everything in between the quotation marks as pure text and ignores all of the HTML tags. Now, by this point, you would have noticed that most of the things that you do with jQuery are implemented using methods, and we're accessing it through the dot notation. Now, remember how when we were learning about methods and functions, we used it a lot to shorten our code and reduce repetition. Well, this is pretty much how jQuery works. If you take a look at the library, then you'll notice that jQuery is completely written in JavaScript, but it has all of these methods that shorten the code that we need to write and makes working with JavaScript to create our websites much, much quicker, much easier, and reduces repetitive strain injury from typing so much. So I hope that you also realize that without understanding how vanilla JavaScript works, then jQuery just seems like complete magic. So it's really important that you needed to get a good foundation in JavaScript before we start introducing you to essentially what most web developers will use when they're writing JavaScript, which is doing it through jQuery or another library. I hope that by this point you've already realized that this library can make your life as a developer so much easier with less things to type and more intuitive syntax. But in the next lesson, we're going to dig into jQuery even further, and we're going to learn how we can manipulate attributes using jQuery. So for all of that, stay tuned. I'll see you on the next lesson.